We started last class with the rabbinic sources. Um, the source that we looked at was the Mishnah in Shabbat and the commentary from the Jerusalem Talmud. I'd like to review this for you with you because I think it's important. We did it at the end of last week's class, but we did a little bit quickly, and I'd like to just go through it again one more time with you, and then we'll look um, at the other major source that we're going to study today from the Talmud. And for those of you who've never studied Jewish texts before, you understand that this is where rabbinic Judaism starts to really transform, and there are many changes um, in rabbinic Judaism from what existed during the times of the temple. Something that we're going to come back to at the end of this class is how the approach of rabbinic Judaism to intermarriage might or might not be affected by the approach of rabbinic Judaism to conversion. In the time of the Second Temple, we often talk historically about there being many different kinds of Judaisms. Okay? If you remember a few years ago when the Dead Sea Scrolls exhibit came to the ROM, there was so much in that exhibit that was very familiar, but if you really looked at it closely, there was a lot in that exhibit that was not familiar. Different books, different practices and customs and laws. That was an example, those who created the Dead Sea Scrolls, right? What some people call the Essenes, the group that was responsible for the creation of the Dead Sea Scrolls, they had their own Judaism, which was very different than, let's say, the Judaism of the Pharisees and the Sadducees, who are spoken of in the New Testament, which are other kinds of Second Temple Judaisms. And these Judaisms had very different approaches on the topic of conversion. Can you all hear me now? Okay, good. The book of Jubilees, which we looked at a couple of weeks ago, or maybe it was last week, the book of Jubilees had a very long section where it reinterpreted the Bible to ban intermarriage in the holiness code of the Bible. Remember where it says, don't give your daughters to Moloch, which we thought was or you would think was an idolatrous god. But Book of Jubilees understands that verse to mean that entails giving your daughter over to a non-Jew, that intermarriage was banned and is punishable by death through that verse. But the Book of Jubilees also does not recognize conversion. There's nothing in the Book of Jubilees that would suggest that you can convert to Judaism, and in fact, a number of passages that suggest that it is impossible to convert to Judaism. This is important because I read somewhere one of the historians that looks at this topic says, of course, rabbinic Judaism allows intermarriage. It just requires you to convert to Judaism first, right? So that we should not take for granted that some of what is going to shape the rabbinic mind on intermarriage might also be the shaping of the rabbinic mind on conversion. If I make a pathway for conversion, then I'm allowed to be perhaps stricter when it comes to intermarriage. But let's look at, before we get there, let's look at what we reviewed at the end of last class, the Mishnah in Masechet Shabbat, the famous story of the attic of Hananiah ben Chizkiah. In that attic, a number of let's say, distancing protocols were established and passed. Can you all see that on your screens? Yes? Were established and passed in the rabbinic court because the house of Shammai outnumbered the house of Hillel. There were 18 regulations that were passed. And the Talmud Yerushalmi explains what those 18 prohibitions are. One of those is their daughters. Now, this is surprising to us because it suggests that the ban against intermarriage is not biblical, is right, but came about during the time of this argument, in other words, of the 2nd century AD, between the house of Hillel and the house of Shammai, which is rather late. That is, it's a rabbinic innovation, the prohibition against intermarriage, and that it was part of a whole series of prohibitions meant to distinguish and define the boundaries between Jews and the culture that was surrounding them. So it was part of other decrees on Gentile bread and Gentile cheese and Gentile oil and their salted food and their language and their gifts and their testimonies, etc., etc. Now, the idea that that ban came about as late as the time of the house of Hillel and the house of Shammai is shocking to Rabbi Yehoshua Onaya, right? He cannot accept, we covered this all at the end of last class, but I'm just refreshing all your memory, right? Rabbi Elazar first says, hold on, doesn't it say in the Torah, Velo titchaten bam, you shall not marry them? So how can you tell me that the prohibition of against intermarriage didn't come about till, a millennia, at least a millennia later, until the house of Hillel and the house of Shammai had their argument in the attic? So one approach is the approach of Rabbi Abin, and Rabbi Abin says the Torah was only forbidding when it says velo titchaten bam, you shall not intermarry with them. It was only forbidding the 7 nations that were indigenous to the land of Israel. That's his approach. And therefore, the house of Hillel and the house of Shammai extended that prohibition to apply to all non-Jews. But Rabbi Yehoshua Onaya doesn't accept any of that. He says, no. In the Torah, it was forbidding all kinds of intermarriage. And in the days of the house of Hillel and the house of Shammai, and what they were arguing about in the attic, it was about their eggs. And sometimes we refer to eggs as sons and daughters, right? But so we were debating whether we could eat eggs produced by a chicken owned from a non-Jewish family, owned by a non-Jewish family, not their daughters and their sons. Right? It's a cute argument, but pay attention closely to what really is at the core of the disagreement between Rabbi Abin and Rabbi Yehoshua Onaya here. What is at the core of their disagreement? Rabbi Abin believes that the prohibition against intermarriage only came about in the days of the house of Hillel and the house of Shammai. That in the days of the Torah, there was only a prohibition against intermarriages with the 7 indigenous nations. Rabbi Yehoshua Onaya says, no, not the case. The ban against intermarriage originated in the Torah. And Beit Hillel and Beit Shammai, they were arguing about something else. Eggs, oil, whatever. But the prohibition was there from the start, right, from the beginning. Now, friends, think for a moment, who really cares when the prohibition came about? And before we go any further, let's talk about this for a second, because that's a fair question, isn't it? Who cares whether the prohibition is in the Torah or the prohibition came about in the times of the house of Hillel and the house of Shammai? A prohibition's a prohibition. When it came on the books and who wrote it down, does it really matter? So let me get all your attention now. Yes, it matters significantly. If a prohibition is in the Torah and it's explicit in the Torah, that's going to be, and the Torah is eternal and applicable in all circumstances. Don't you agree? It's going to be pretty difficult to get around that prohibition. If I'm Rabbi Yehoshua Onaya saying intermarriage is banned in the Torah, in later generations, how am I going to argue with that prohibition? How could I possibly overturn it? But if I believe that the prohibition against intermarriage only came about in the time of the house of Hillel and the house of Shammai, maybe I could say, guess what, folks? There are many prohibitions that are in that list of 18 that we no longer hold by today because circumstances have changed. Do we hold by, are we permitted to eat non-Jewish oil, products made with oil that was not produced by a Jew? Of course. There's many oils that have an OU symbol on it that weren't produced by a Jewish harvester, right? Because circumstances changed. It was an important issue in the time of Hillel and Shammai, the house of Hillel, the house of Shammai in the 2nd century, but it was not an important issue later, right? So it does matter a great deal when this came on the books, because this class is about exploring possibilities for dealing with this prohibition. And if it is in the Torah, we don't have much to say. So I want everybody to understand, even if you think it is in the Torah, right? We're not here to study our points of view. I want the official rabbinic Judaism point of view, that in the time of the Talmud, they are arguing over whether a ban of intermarriage came about because of specific concerns in a specific time, in a specific place, which required the delineation of boundaries between Jews and the outside culture, or it always was on the books and existed from the time of the Torah. So it is very important who is right in that argument between Rabbi Abin and Rabbi Yehoshua Onaya. Okay, all of those sources were from the Talmud Yerushalmi. The Talmud Yerushalmi, I don't know if you've ever studied that before, but the Talmud Yerushalmi was produced in the Galilee before the Talmud Bavli, the Babylonian Talmud, was edited. The Babylonian Talmud is considered to be more complete because it came about later and so includes the earlier sources in addition to the contemporary sources. It also is, if you study the Babylonian Talmud, it tends to be a lot clearer and richer in the way it presents the material. It doesn't use shorthand like the Yerushalmi often uses shorthand to tell a story. It will give you much more details. But here, we're not, in the Bavli, we're not dealing with Masechet Shabbat anymore, with the section about the 18 decrees. We'll get there. It'll come into this discussion sort of in a backhand way. But the base Mishnah that we're dealing with is right here on your screen. Let's take a look at it. It is from Tractate Sanhedrin. Hagonev, I'm reading it in Hebrew because it's pretty short. Hagonev et haksuha vehamekalel bakosem vehaboel aramit kanaim pogimbo. So among the categories where zealots are permitted to, what's the right word? To slay, to kill, to murder. It's not, is the category of a person who is found having intercourse with an Aramean, which is interpreted here to be a non-Jew. So there is a Mishnah in Sanhedrin which says, now this doesn't say you should. It doesn't say you can. It doesn't say you must. Be careful with the language here. It just says, if you have intercourse with an Aramean woman, the zealots will probably kill you. Does anyone know what story in the Bible this might be referring to? If you remember the story in the Bible of Pinchas and Zimri, right? Parshat Pinchas in the Bible. What happens? Pinchas sees someone having relations with a non-Jewish woman, a Moabite woman, in the front of the tent of meeting. And what does he do? In a zealous rage, you remember the story? Takes a spear and just vigilante justice, right? Vigilante extremism, and decides to slay them right there, which seems to suggest that the Torah is permitting zealous extremism against those who are having relations. This is not marriage. This is someone having sex. Now, it's important that you realize this is not marriage. This is about having sex, because if the Mishnah says the zealous people are going to kill the Jewish man and the non-Jewish woman, or the Aramean woman, if they're caught having sex together, it seems to me that we don't have to talk about marriage, right? We have to deal with this before we get to marriage. It's sort of obvious that if you get slayed for having sexual relations with a non-Jewish woman, marriage is off the table. So let's see today how the Babylonian Talmud makes sense of this quite stringent, or not stringent, this quite extremist passage in the Mishnah in Sanhedrin. Okay, Razi, would you do us the honor of reading this next section?
Sure.
Let me scroll down and we'll do it in English. Okay, I'm going to interrupt you here quite a few times with respect.
The Mishnah teaches that one who engages in intercourse with the Aramean woman is among those liable to be killed by zealots.
So here I used a careful language in my transition. Among those liable to be killed by zealots. If you're having sex with an Aramean woman, defined here also as any non-Jewish woman, you might get killed by people who are extreme. Go ahead, Razi.
Rav Kahana asked of Rav if zealots did not strike him, what is the halacha?
Right. So here it seems to be clear that the Mishnah is not suggesting you have to kill this guy, because it says, well, what if nobody does? Right? So Rav Kahana goes to Rav and says, okay, we understand that somebody who has sex with a non-Jewish woman is liable to be killed by zealous, but what if there's no zealous person around? Does that make it okay? You know, what are we supposed to do then? So what happened to Rav?
Rav forgot that which he learned through tradition concerning this matter.
So these are people, and they forget sometimes. Rav says, you know, that's a good question, but I forget. I forget what happens. Now, you can all read into that. What does that mean? That in the days of Rav, he forgot what would happen to a non-Jew sleeping with a Jewish man, having relations with a Jewish man. If he forgot it, probably this wasn't going on, one might presume. Okay, keep going, Razi.
Just a minute. I'm lost for a minute. Hang on. Okay, I'm back.
You're back. Okay. They
read this verse to Rav Kahana in his dream. Judah has dealt treacherously, and an abomination is committed in Israel and in Jerusalem. as Judah has profaned the sacred of the Lord, which he loves, and has engaged in intercourse with the daughter of a strange god.
Now, some of you might remember that we've seen this verse before. So Rav Kahana went to Rav and said, Rav, what do we do in a case where the zealots don't kill? And Rav forgot. So Rav Kahana left. His Rebbe didn't have the answer. But a miracle happened, and Rav Kahana had a dream. And in the dream, this verse came to him. It is a verse, folks, that we saw a few weeks ago. Let's take a look here. We go back to Sefer Malachi, which is one of the prophets. Take a look. Bagda Yehuda v'to'evan esta b'Yisrael. Judah has been unfaithful. A detestable thing has been committed in Israel and in Jerusalem. Judah has desecrated the sanctuary of the Lord. The Lord loves. How? By marrying women who worship a foreign god. The book of Malachi is a very early explicit reference to a prohibition against intermarriage that does not restrict that prohibition to the 7 nations indigenous to the land of Israel, right? The book of Malachi seems to be saying, because in the time of Malachi, those 7 nations were long gone. So he seems to be saying, you've desecrated the sanctuary of the Lord. How? By marrying foreign women. As for the man who does this, whoever he may be, the Lord remove him from the tents of Jacob, even though he brings an offering to the Lord Almighty. So this verse came to Rav Kahana in his dream. And what does he do with once he has this dream? He goes back to his Rebbe, goes back to Rav, and tells him what he dreamt. Go ahead, Razi, right here where it says Rav Kahana.
Rav Kahana came and said to Rav, this is what they read to me in my dream.
This is what I let me tell you what dream I had. This is the verse that they read. And then Rav says, oh yeah, now I remember. Razi, go ahead.
Rav then remembered that which he learned through tradition and said, Judah has dealt treacherously. This is a reference to the sin of idol worship.
Great.
Has engaged in intercourse with the daughter of a strange god. This is a reference to one who engages in intercourse with a Gentile woman.
Go ahead.
And it is written thereafter with regard to those enumerated in the verse, may the Lord excise the man who does this, who calls and who answers from the tents of Jacob, and he who sacrifices a meal offering to the Lord of hosts. Malachi,
so right, the
2:12.
same. These are the 2 verses from Sefer Malachi. It's one right after the other. And Rav says, I now remember what that verse means. You had the dream of the verse, and I will tell you how we, in the rabbinic circles, how we interpret that verse. How do we interpret it? That it is a reference first to the sin of idol worship, and second, it is a reference to sex, intercourse with the daughter of a strange god, right? Bat El Nechar in Hebrew, the daughter of a strange god. In other words, a non-Jewish woman. And the next verse must apply to that person. And the next verse says, may God excise such a man. So what does that mean? That God is going to excise such a person. So go ahead, Razi. The Gemara interprets the verse.
The Gemara interprets the verse. If he is a Torah scholar, he will have neither one among his descendants who call and initiates discourse among the sages, nor one who answers among the students.
So what does it mean that God will cut off such a person? This is what Rav is saying. Okay, so nobody came and killed this guy, but don't worry. Hashem's going to ruin his offspring. The offspring of such a person, they will not be scholars and they will not be students. It's a way of saying your children will be lowlifes, right? That will be God's way of punishing somebody who has intercourse with a non-Jewish woman. And what if he's a priest?
If he is a priest, he will not have among his descendants a son who sacrifices a meal offering to the Lord of
Right.
hosts.
So if you're a priest and you have relations with a non-Jewish woman, you're not your kids are not going to be priests. They're also going to turn into lowlives. It's just a way of saying fate will take care of this man. Rabbi Chia bar Avuya.
Rabbi Haya bar Avuya says, with regard to anyone who engages in intercourse with a Gentile woman, it is though he married the object of idol worship itself, as it is written, and has engaged in intercourse with the daughter of a strange god.
So since the non-Jewish woman is referred to in the Torah as Bat El Nechar, the daughter of a foreign god, the daughter of a strange god, Rabbi Chia bar Avuya says, and this is very important, folks, because remember, we talked about the connection early on in the Torah between intermarriage and idol worship. Well, here, Rabbi Chia bar Avuya sees a strong connection not between intermarriage and idol worship, but between intercourse with a non-Jewish woman and idol worship. It's the same thing. To have relations with a non-Jewish woman is like having relations with a non-Jewish god.
Does a strange god have a daughter? Rather, this is a reference to one who engages in intercourse with a Gentile woman.
Right. So it's the same. When you have having intercourse with a Gentile woman is the same as having intercourse with a Gentile man. Before we do this next sentence, I just want to emphasize to everybody, I think this is an important source. I haven't included every source from the Talmud, but I think this is an important one because I just want to emphasize to you all, this passage is not about marriage. It is about sex. And that's important to realize because we're going to have to return to this later on. If this is what Rabbi Chia bar Avuya says about sex with a non-Jewish woman, right? What is he going to say about marriage? You're right. The terms are so graphic, so serious here, that there's no question that he would rule out entirely and have even more probably graphic and terrible things to say about intermarriage if this is what he's saying about relations with a non-Jewish woman. Okay, so last sentence here, Razy, and I want to say something else about this sentence too, because this is another weird sentence.
Rather, this is a reference to one who engages in intercourse with a Gentile woman.
Yeah,
When Rav Dimi came from Eretz Israel to Babylonia, he said, the court of Hasmoneans issued a decree that one who engages in intercourse with a Gentile woman is liable.
Right. So this decree that you are liable for if you have relations with a Gentile woman, according to Rav Dimi, it comes from the court of the Hasmoneans. Now, how do you all know the court of the Hasmoneans? Is that familiar to you at all? Hashmonaim. We know it from the story of Hanukkah. Now, who is the court of the Hashmonaim? No one knows. I asked a few people this, scholars much brighter and wiser than me, and they said one of the interesting things about this passage is that we don't know anything about the court of the Hashmonaim. One friend of mine said that when it uses the word the court of the Hashmonaim, it might be a way of saying, just broadly, this happened in the second time of the Second Temple. When they couldn't point, the later rabbis, to an exact place, an exact court, an exact figure when a prohibition came about, they used this broad term, it happened during the time of the court of the Hashmonaim, to say sometime around the period of the Second Temple, a prohibition came about that forbade intercourse between Jews and non-Jews. And I just want to revert back to what I said before we reviewed this passage. It is important to note that in this source as well, the prohibition against intercourse here, but maybe intermarriage as well, is not in the Torah. It came about in a time, in a place, because of circumstances in the culture. In this source too, it happened in the Second Temple period. A prohibition came about, but it is not a prohibition that is found in the Torah. Okay, now our final source, also from the Babylonian Talmud. Thank you, Razi. Thank you. Our final source, also from the Babylonian Talmud, is a little bit complicated, but it's really important. Roz, could you read this source? Thank you. I'm going to put it all on the screen now. And again, I'm apologizing. I'm going to interrupt you a few times. Because it's a bit tricky, maybe take out a pen and paper. You might want to write some notes, but I'll try and go slowly. I'll stop frequently. And the other thing I did here was number the different sections of this conversation in the Babylonian Talmud. And I also made a graph to help us all understand later on. Okay, so we'll go really slowly. This is from the tractate called Avodah Zarah, which deals with idol worship. And let's start with number 1. Okay, Roz, go ahead.
Okay, number 1. The Gemara discusses the matter itself. Balai says that Avimi of Nota says in the name of Rav, the prohibitions with regard to Gentiles' bread and their oil, their wine, and their daughters are all from the 18 matters issued in a single day in the time of the students of Shammai and Hillel. The Gemara
So is that familiar to everybody? Is that familiar to everybody? The 18 matters, that's the attic. It's the source that we looked at from Tractate Shabbat. So Bali, for him, it's very clear that the prohibition against intermarriage was one of the 18 decrees issued in that attic, along with their bread, their oil. Okay, so the prohibition came about late. Then the Gemara asks,
with regard to their daughters, what is the decree? Rabbi Naaman bar Yitzchak says, they decreed upon their daughters that they should be classified as menstruating women from the time they are in the cradle, i.e., they decreed that from when they are young, Gentile women are always considered to be menstruating.
So in other words, this is a strange passage. We could have a whole conversation about the rabbis and their lack of understanding, perhaps, of female menstrual cycles. But what the rabbis are basically saying here is the decree against their daughters, it doesn't come into force when that daughter is a particular age. It is an all-encompassing decree. You cannot marry a non-Jewish woman ever, ever, ever at any stage of her life. Okay? That's Bali. Now Geneva.
The Gemara presents another opinion, and Geneva said in the name of Rav, Gentiles' bread, oil, wine, and daughters were all decreed upon due to the concern that Jews might participate in idol worship with Gentiles as a result of intermingling with them, as when Rav Ahabar Ada came from Eretz Israel to Babylonia, he said that Rabbi Yitzchak says, they decreed a prohibition upon their bread due to their oil. The Gemara asks, is this what is the prohibition with regard to oil stronger than the prohibition with regard to bread? That is, why does the primary concern relate to the oil of Gentiles rather than their bread?
So I know there's a lot there. Let's start right from the beginning about what Geneva says. This is a different opinion than Bali. Bali says the prohibition against intermarriage was part of a whole list of 18 different restrictions, boundary-making restrictions that were imposed by the house of Shammai at that time in order to preserve cultural distinctiveness, let's say. Geneva says, nope, there was a different reason why all of these things were prohibited. It wasn't to preserve cultural distinctiveness. What was the reason, Roz, according to Geneva?
It was upon their bread due because of the oil.
No.
Oh, idol worship. They might
Aha.
participate
Everyone
in idol
circle,
worship.
everyone circle and underline and highlight that word. All of these prohibitions, according to Geneva, they all come down to one thing: not cultural distinctiveness,
Idol
not
worship.
boundaries. It's all about idol worship. If you marry their daughters, if you eat their bread, if you drink their wine, you will end up worshiping idols. And that is what motivated the house of Shammai. They saw there was idol worship going on, and so they created all of these rules in order to stop it. Right? And so what they're talking about here is something that we've spoken about earlier. What is, or not what they're talking about, what they're arguing about. What is the primary concern here, and what is the secondary concern? For Bali, I hope you're all with me here because this is important. For Bali, intermarriage is a primary concern. We must stop intermarriage. Why? Because preserving boundaries is about Jewish survival, cultural distinctiveness, maintaining norms. We're prohibiting intermarriage in and of itself for itself. For Geneva, intermarriage is a secondary concern, it seems. It is only being prohibited, along with the whole list of other stuff that's being prohibited, because it might lead to idol worship. And so you see here language about primary concerns. That's what the Talmud is going to argue here. So Rav Yitzchak said they decreed a prohibition upon their bread due to their oil. In other words, they were afraid that their oil was going to be used on their bread. So hold on. So why is it that the prohibition against oil is stronger than regard to their bread? Why are we more afraid of their oil than we are afraid of their bread? So continue here, Roz. The Gemara offers a different interpretation. You're right. That makes sense. So now the Gemara says, okay, let's say something else then.
Rather, they issued a decree prohibiting their bread and their oil due to their wine.
So it's really not about the bread and the oil. They're both sort of okay, but it's really about the wine. That's the bad one.
And they issued the decree prohibiting their wine due to the fact that this leads to familiarity, and Jews will come to marry their daughters.
So wine isn't even the primary concern yet. Bread's not the primary concern. Oil's not the primary concern. We thought maybe wine was the primary concern, right? Because maybe it's a kosher thing. Maybe we're afraid that the, I don't know, the grapes they use aren't kosher. No. It's not about that. It's because wine leads to familiarity, and because you're drunk, you're in a bar, and you're going to come to marry the person you're drinking with. So the primary concern so far is it is about their daughters. You will come to marry their daughters if we permit you to drink their wine.
And they issued a decree prohibiting their daughters due to something else.
So look at this.
Idolatry.
So even their daughters is not the primary concern. We thought it was their bread. Nope. Thought it was their oil. Nope. We thought it was the wine. Nope. It's not either of those three. Is it their intermarriage that's the problem? Nope. It's not intermarriage. It's about davar acher. The Gemara uses the language davar acher. By the way, in this translation, which is from the Sefaria website, which is an excellent, excellent website, by the way, that the Kashitsky family of Toronto sponsored. That website, they do this wonderful thing where they use bold language to reflect the exact translation from the Talmud, and the words that are not bolded are interpretations, explanations, the most common explanations and interpretations. So the Gemara doesn't even say the word idolatry because it's so offensive and disgusting to the Talmud that it calls it davar acher. Davar acher is something else. It's not about their daughters, it's about that other thing, idolatry. Keep going, Roz.
And they further issued a decree on something else due to something else, which will be explained by the Gemara.
It's not even idolatry. There's even a bigger concern, which we're also going to call something else, but it ends up actually being about idolatry. That is the root for Geneva of this prohibition. We are worried about idolatry.
Number four, it was stated that the prohibition against marrying the daughters of Gentiles was decreed on account of idolatry. The Gemara raises an objection, but the prohibition against marrying their daughters is prescribed by Torah law as it is written, quote, neither shall you make marriages with them, Deuteronomy 7:3.
So this means we're understanding. Look at this now. We've seen that verse before, friends. That's good. So the Talmud is wrestling with the same sources that we're wrestling with. So you're telling me, according to Geneva, that the prohibition against intermarriage only came about in the time of the house of Hillel and the house of Shammai because they were worried about idolatry. But the Torah says, lo titchatein bam. So how can you tell me this came about late when it seems to say in the Torah that you're not allowed to intermarry? So what is the answer? It's not going to surprise many of you. What is the Talmud answer? Nope, the Torah did not forbid intermarriage. Go ahead, Roz. The Gemara explains.
By Torah law, intermarriage is prohibited only with the 7 Canaanite nations, but intermarriage with the other nations of the world is not prohibited. And the students of Shammai and Hillel came and decreed that intermarriage is prohibited even with the other nations.
So didn't you all expect this? Yes, we've learned that a common rabbinic understanding of that verse in Deuteronomy, which prohibits intermarriage, with those words, lo titchatein bam, that a common understanding of that is it only applied to the 7 Canaanite nations. Not until 1,000 at least years later, till the time of the house of Hillel, house of Shammai, did the prohibition come to be to all other nations. But hold on, the Talmud is still a little bit uncomfortable with that. You're telling me that for all of those years, intermarriage was allowed, right? For all of those centuries, it was allowed. So go ahead, Roz, number 5.
The Gemara asks, and according to the opinion of Rabbi Shimon ben Yochai, who says that the subsequent verse, for he will turn away your son from following me, serves to include all who turn away one son from God. That is, all Gentiles. What is there to say?
So now the Gemara introduces the opinion of Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai. You know Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, one of the most famous rabbis in the Talmud, right? It's his Lag BaOmer is his day. Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai had a different understanding of that verse in Deuteronomy. For him, the prohibition, lo titchatein bam, you shall not marry with them, was not about the 7 Canaanite nations, but included everyone, all Gentiles. So what do we say to him? What was it that Hillel and Shammai, the house of Hillel and the house of Shammai, were debating if the ban against intermarriage pre-existed them and actually was around since the time of the Torah? Go ahead, Ross.
Rather, by Torah law, only sexual relations by way of marriage are prohibited, and they came and decreed that sexual relations are prohibited even by way of licentiousness.
So what do we say to Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai? Yes, you're right, Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai. In the Torah, there was a prohibition against marriage, but the house of Hillel and the house of Shammai were arguing about something else. They were arguing about casual sex. Or in their day, casual sex was permitted, and they decided to put a stop to it. That's what it means that they issued a decree against their daughters, right? It wasn't about marriage. It was about casual sex. But this also doesn't make those studying in the Beit Midrash comfortable. Why? Keep going, Roz. Number 6.
Number 6, the Gemara raises an objection. Licentious sexual intercourse was also prohibited earlier, as they decreed a prohibition in this regard in the court of Shem, as it is written, quote, it was told to Judah, saying, Tamar, your daughter-in-law, has played the harlot, and moreover, behold, she is with child by harlotry. And Judah said, bring her forth, and let her be burned. This proves that the prohibition against licentious intercourse with a Gentile was in force long before the time of the students of Shammai and Hillel.
So why is this Talmud not comfortable with the idea that casual sex was prohibited by the house of Hillel and the house of Shammai, casual sex between a Jew and a non-Jew, because of the story that maybe some of you remember from the book of Genesis of Yehudah and Tamar. Okay, you can all, after this class, go back to your Chumashim or just Google it, the story of Judah and Tamar. But remember what Judah says, Tamar, because she had relations with a non-Jewish man, Judah says, let her be burned. That means already in the book of Genesis, right, which is what they call the court of Shem. We don't know of any court of Shem, by the way. It's unlikely there ever was a court of Shem. But what the Talmud is trying to say is, already in the days of the book of Genesis, there was a prohibition on the books that Jewish women could not be, at least Jewish women, could not be involved with non-Jewish men. And so don't tell me that that's what Hillel and Shammai came about and decreed, because it was on the books 1,000 years at least earlier. Okay, so we have to try something else. Let's try something else, Roz. Number 7.
Okay, the Gemara explains.
Everyone, I know this is complicated, but don't worry, I have a chart. It's going to break it down and make it very simple.
The Gemara explains, rather, the prohibition prescribed by Torah law applies to the case of a Gentile who engaged in intercourse with a Jewish woman, as she is drawn after him toward idolatry. But the case of a Jew who engaged in intercourse, can you lift it, please?
Yes. Sorry about that.
But the case with a Gentile woman is not included in the prohibition by Torah law. And the students of Shammai and Hillel came and decreed that the prohibition applies even to a Jew who engaged in intercourse with a Gentile woman.
So this is the response to the Talmud's objection. The Talmud says, well, how can you say that the house of Hillel and the house of Shammai decreed on casual sex when we have this story of Yehuda and Tamar in the Torah, where it seems to be very clear in the story that casual sex is prohibited. So now the Talmud answers something which actually brings into our discussion something that maybe some of you have been waiting for, which is the gender aspect. Tamar was a Jewish woman, and obviously a Jewish woman would not be allowed to have casual sex with a non-Jewish man. Why? Because it was a patriarchal society where that Jewish woman would become absorbed into the family of the Jewish man and thereby disappear from the Jewish continuity picture. But something had changed in the time of the house of Hillel, the house of Shammai, where they say, before the men, the Jewish men, were allowed to be with non-Jewish women because we weren't worried that the Jewish man would become absorbed into her family. Come on, this is a patriarchy. We're not worried about that. If anything, we'll have another Jewish family because she'll be absorbed into our group. But by the time the house of Hillel, the house of Shammai come along, they say, we need to review this. We're changing the rules. Who knows why, by the way? Is it possible that maybe we're living in a less patriarchal time when the house of Hillel, the house of Shammai come around? Remember, it's also during this time when Jewish descent changes from being patriarchal, where you acquire your Jewish status from your father. It's also during that time where that changes and you start to acquire your Jewish status from your mother. So it seems that in the days of the house of Hillel, the house of Shammai, there was already a lot of consideration about gender roles and who is primary and who is not. And according to this section of the Talmud, this also changes with regards to the prohibition against casual sex. And now both Jewish men and Jewish women, just like the Jewish women have been prohibited for a very long time, now the Jewish men also are prohibited from having intercourse with a Gentile woman. But even that doesn't end the discussion, unfortunately. I'm sorry, folks. I don't write this stuff. I just present. Roz, keep going. Number 8.
Okay, the Gemara rejects this. The prohibition concerning a Jew who engaged in intercourse with a Gentile woman is a halacha transmitted to Moses from Sinai, not a rabbinic ordinance. As the master said, with regard to one who engages in intercourse with an Aramean woman, zealots may attack him, as Pinchas did to Zimri in the wilderness.
So do you all understand this challenge? This challenge says, well, hold on. If you're telling me that Jewish men were always allowed to take Gentile women, to have casual intercourse with Gentile women, at least they were always allowed until Hillel and Shammai, the house of Hillel, the house of Shammai came along. So how do you explain the story of Pinchas and Zimri and the Moabite woman? The story I mentioned earlier. Pinchas took a spear and killed them. Well, why did he kill them if they were allowed? Right? So that is the objection. So now the Talmud has to say, okay, well, I guess there's something else we have to consider. Go ahead, Roz.
Okay, number 9. He said to him, by Torah law, intercourse with a Gentile is prohibited in public and only in situations like the incident that occurred, as described in Numbers chapter 25.
That means Pinchas and Zimri. So what was the problem with Pinchas and Zimri and what gave him permission to take that spear, drive it through him? It was because they had sex in
public.
Right. And Hillel and Shammai, they knew that it was prohibited in public, but they came and decreed that the prohibition applies even in private. Oh no, but even that's not going to satisfy them. The Gemara raises another difficulty. This was also prohibited in private. as the court of the Hasmoneans decreed that it is prohibited, right? And this goes on, so on and so on and so on. I will save us all because even I'm confused with all of this stuff. And get to the last point. The Gemara answers, when the court of the Hasmoneans decreed, they prohibited only sexual intercourse, but with regard to seclusion with a Gentile woman, they did not prohibit that. And so the students of Shammai and Hillel came and decreed that even seclusion with a Gentile woman is prohibited. Some of you may have heard about that prohibition against seclusion. It's called yichud, right? You're not allowed to be in the same room with a non-Jewish woman alone. So that's how this whole thing ends, is how do we make peace with the decree of Hillel and Shammai? We say that in the end, they prohibited seclusion, but everything else was prohibited way back. So this is if you look at the graph that's on I tried to make sense of this. I'm sorry that it's a bit confusing, but I tried to make sense with this by making this graph. So according to the flow of the argument here, you shall not marry them. That verse that's in the Torah, that verse banned intermarriage with all non-Jews, right? That's what Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai believed, that verse was the verse that banned intermarriage. In other words, it is a ban in the Torah. The Beit Midrasho Shel Shem, right, in the book of Genesis, also banned Jewish women from casual intercourse with non-Jewish men. Then in the time of Moses, the story of Pinchas and Zimri, the spear being driven through, that banned Jewish men from casual intercourse with non-Jewish women, but in public. Then the Hashmonean court, in other words, the second temple, that banned Jewish men from casual intercourse with non-Jewish women, even in private. And the house of Hillel, the house of Shammai, were arguing about private seclusion with Gentile women. That is, in the end, what the decree was about. That's one point of view. And if you don't think that lo titchaten bam, the intermarriage prohibition in the Torah, applied to all non-Jewish women, if you think that it only applied to the 7 indigenous nations, right, then the story of Zimri and Pinchas, that's the spear, it, you could say, possibly authorizes vigilante action with respect to casual intercourse with non-Jews. And the house of Hillel and the house of Shammai, they're the ones who banned intermarriage and sexual contact with all Gentile women. So it is a huge lapse of time, a huge difference in these approaches. If you believe that the prohibition against intermarriage was on the books from the time of the Torah, you're talking about more than a millennia where Jews were not allowed to marry non-Jews. If you only think that verse applied to the 7 indigenous nations, then during that millennia, technically, Jews were permitted to marry non-Jews. That's a huge period of time that they're arguing about. Think about it. 1,000 years, more than 1,000 years, where nobody really knows, were you allowed to intermarry or were you not allowed to intermarry? So this, folks, I'm sorry that it ends with something confusing, but that is the final rabbinic source prohibiting intermarriage. I want to mention, before we have our discussion, a couple of points that I think are really important. Number one, it is, in my view, unambiguous, according to the rabbinic material, that intimacy and intermarriage are prohibited. You could find many other sources that I didn't want to drain your minds with, but I could have included many other sources which also make it clear that in the Talmud, both sex and marriage with non-Jews are prohibited. There is no dissenting voice on those issues, right? But there are two things that I want to leave on the table. Actually, three. Number one, what I mentioned at the beginning of the class. Let us remember that these same rabbis permitted conversion. Unlike other Second Temple Judaisms, which did not. And perhaps, the stringent view on intermarriage must be understood in the context of a Judaism that embraced converts. And therefore, it's not so strict. As I mentioned earlier, you might even say, as one person did, Judaism does permit intermarriage. They did permit intermarriage, the rabbis. They just required you to convert first. So I want to make that point clear, because clearly for the rabbis, this is not a question of race or ethnicity, because they permit conversion. It is a matter of identity, of ideological purity, of cultural distinctiveness. That is what it is about for them. It is not about this sacred bloodline that we have encountered before. That's the first thing I want to leave on the table. Number two, we still don't have an answer to the question of what is the first order concern and what is the second order concern. Is intermarriage prohibited in and of itself because it is the problem? Or, as we saw in this recent source, is intermarriage a problem because it is associated with idolatry? In that context, I want to remind you all that the Talmud says you can't drink water if you find it by the side of the road in an unopened bottle. That's what the Talmud says. Why? Because a poisonous snake might have come along and injected poison into the bottle. That is true. Well, if I'm living in Toronto, I don't think there are any poisonous snakes in Toronto, are there? I don't think so. But if I'm living in Toronto, would that prohibition apply? Or I'm living in somewhere else where there are no poisonous snakes? I'm throwing at you this example to present the importance of resolving, so you understand the importance of understanding what the primary concern is and what the secondary concern is. If I can't drink that bottle of water in and of itself, then in an environment where there are no poisonous snakes, I still can't drink the water. But if the primary concern is that the water is poisonous, and I know I'm living in an environment where that poison is not a concern, then maybe I can drink the water. And in fact, there were rabbis who said, you can drink the water because you're living in a place where there are no poisonous snakes. Now, friends, this is a little bit of a foreshadowing of what could happen. If idol worship is the primary concern, and I'm not making this up, this is in the Talmud, we looked at it ourselves, right? If idolatry is the primary concern, what about Toronto in 2021, where idolatry is not the same problem as it was in the 2nd century Greco-Roman context? Is that sufficient to relax a prohibition against intermarriage? I'm giving you difficult things to think about and why it is important to understand what the primary motivation is and what the secondary motivation is. And the third thing I want to leave on the table is what I mentioned before, which is the question of scope. What is it that the Torah is prohibiting here? And what is it that the rabbis are prohibiting here? if the Torah is prohibiting something, the Torah is eternal and applies in every context, in every circumstance. But what are the rabbis prohibiting? The source of rabbinic prohibitions tends to be political responses, often to contemporary reality. Well, they're responding to the reality around them. Maybe that reality no longer applies to us. Among those 18 decrees that the rabbis banned, right, in that attic, was foreign languages. Well, this class is being delivered in English. Am I violating? If I'm violating that, then am I allowed also to violate everything else, including their daughters, their sons? So if I ascribe the ban to the house of Hillel, the house of Shammai, I have a bit of an easier pathway to finding ways that I might relax the restrictions. If I believe, like Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai believed, that when the Torah says, "V'lo titchatein bam," you shall not marry them, that it was talking about everyone, every non-Jew, my options are going to be much more limited. But the Talmud is actively struggling with that question. With all of these back and forth, well, is it about their oil? Is it about their bread? Is it about their idolatry? What about the story of Zimri? What about the story of Yehuda and Tamar? What about all of these stories that talk about boundaries between Jews and non-Jews being, in some cases, erased and in some cases strengthened? If these stories exist, where do they come from? What is the origin? And what can we ascribe to rabbinic bans that applied to a specific time and a specific age? And what do we say is just always an unchanging prohibition? Okay, folks, there was a lot in one class. I'm sorry, but I hope it gives us all an appreciation for what is still on the table, right? And that this discussion is so much richer when it's not about demographics. I haven't showed you any statistics yet. And it's so much better when we don't have statistics on the table, when we're thinking about, let's leave those aside and just deal with, where did this ban come from? What might have motivated it? And how do we understand its progression? And maybe even its flexibility as the centuries passed. Okay,